Okay, so um, we've already discussed how the Jews are not especially so attracted to farming, right? Not such a great profession for Jews. But one of the areas where Jews chose to excel and have a very, very long history is in commerce. We've also looked in previous classes at the Radhanites, who are probably the most famous of the Jewish travelers and international commercial agents of the 9th century, described by Muslim historiography. This particular map, which kind of like gives you, I think, a little bit of an exaggerated picture, but it errs a little bit on the side of expansion. But the blue routes are the ones that are associated with the Radhanites, and the pink ones are the ones that connect to it. But it gives you a sense of how these Radhanites, who are probably based in southern France on the Rhone River, nevertheless had an amazing trade network that extended over all of the known world at that time. The risks and benefits of commerce. Well, the risks are pretty obvious, right? You're traveling, you're going to dangerous places. People don't necessarily know you there. You've got to get your goods over land or over sea. All kinds of things can go wrong, but the benefits are huge. The profit margin can be massive, especially if you pick up some lightweight goods like, silks or spices, very popular in the West, and you bring them over there, the markup can be massive and you can really bring in a lot of cash. There is a huge amount of profit to be had for a relatively smaller amount of effort. Some risk, as we saw earlier, for example, the Maimonides family was impoverished when the elder brother of Moses Maimonides was at sea with his worldly goods, and the ship sank, causing Maimonides to have to take up position as a physician, which he turned out to do very well at, and also as an unpaid rabbi. But these commercial sellers had a tremendous amount of possibility for profit if they did it well. And also it's a collective effort where, it's not so much that you personally have to schlep across the Mediterranean to get the goods and bring them back. You just have to know the right people who make much smaller journeys on your behalf, especially as you become a much more established salesman. The dangers of travel and transport are huge, but as the economy begins to develop and these trade networks, we can actually see how they expand over time. They're seen to be profitable by everyone involved, and so they are generally very protected, especially in the Islamic areas where you have, everything is under Muslim rule rather than a patchwork of different rules of warring regions. And the Jews have a leg up in this. The Jews, of course, were not the only international travelers, and the Jews were not at all the only international commercial agents, but they did have a decided advantage which made them disproportionately important to international trade. This diaspora advantage includes a few things. First of all, the Jews have a common language. So when they are traveling to far-flung regions, you can have a Jew from England communicating with a Jew from Central Asia because they've got a common language in Hebrew. That's an incredibly important thing. Now, they might not be deeply fluent in Hebrew, but they certainly know enough to engage in the basic communication of negotiation for price and goods and so on. Secondly, also extremely important, they have a unified legal system, and maybe even more important than the system, the norms, expectations, how commerce is done. If you can imagine even today walking, if you ever gone, for example, to the Arab Shuk long before it was as dangerous as it is now, but if you went into the Arab Shuk and you didn't know the kind of culture of negotiation of how you're not supposed to pay the first price they mention, and you're only supposed to negotiate in good faith if you really will buy it, all kinds of things like that, you might not necessarily know those rules. Well, because the Jews are all steeped in the same Talmudic tradition with the same laws and the same avenues of appeal if they feel that they're not being treated appropriately in a financial endeavor, then you have a whole system, a whole structure that allows it to take place. If you can imagine a Christian traveling deep in Muslim territory, let's say in what would be contemporary Iraq, he would feel extremely out of place, especially after the Crusades. Oh my gosh, be extremely unwelcome. He would not have the built-in support system there that would be able to take him in and would be able to provide food and lodgings for him at a reasonable price and protection from being robbed and so on to allow him to do business. The Jews had these things because of the diaspora itself. Ironically, the diaspora, which was a punishment inflicted upon the Jews, if you want from a theological perspective, or if you want just from a political historical perspective, the Jews were forced into this scattered exile across all of the known lands of the earth. It actually was able to work to their benefit when they established these far-flung international connections. I can tell you just from my personal experience, there was, I grew up in, I'm going to show you a picture later, but I grew up in a far-flung, very remote part of northern Canada. And every year there was a charity collector for the Beis Yaakov of Montreal, right, a girls' school in Montreal, who would hitchhike all the way up from Toronto. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of miles. We're literally the only thing beyond the streets that I lived on was the Arctic Circle in the North Pole, and he would hitchhike all the way up there for the handful of Jews that lived within a 50-mile radius. And when he got up there, he would, my parents would kick me out of my bedroom, and he would get my bedroom. I would sleep in the sofa in the living room, and that's just the way it was because that was Jewish connections. So the same thing is pertaining in medieval Europe, where Jews are able to travel with much more reliance on hachnasat orchim, on the hospitality extended to guests and so on, and this was a massive advantage for them. This is, I'm guessing, why the Jews developed this unusual habit of playing Jewish geography with one another. I don't know if non-Jews do this, but when Jews meet each other, especially in a setting where they don't expect to meet other Jews, something like that, almost always the first things they start doing is they start playing a game where they ask, okay, where are you from? Oh, you're from Manitoba. I know some Jews in Manitoba. Do you know the, right? And they start to immediately try to develop a web of connection that makes them feel plugged into the worldwide tribe of Jews. So this Jewish geography game, I wouldn't be surprised if it had its cultural roots deep in the medieval commercial enterprise, where Jews traveling would try to develop a richer network of connections. Now, what did they sell? This is a little bit more controversial, as you can see from this particular image, which depicts a negotiation between a Jewish slave trader and a king over the price of the slaves that are held in manacles there. From the 5th through the 7th century, the most popular items that Jews were selling were luxury items from the East, like perfumes, glassware, still very expensive, silks, and the spices. We already talked about the silk route, the spice route from the East. And these things will be brought towards the West, and Jews were especially associated with that trade. Now, the wise way to conduct trade, of course, is to have your ships full both ways. So if you're traveling out to the East, you have goods from the West to sell to the East, and then you can bring things back from the West. You never have your ships empty as they leave port. So 5th to 7th century, 7th century is significant because that's the beginning of the Muslim expansion, right? The 4th decade of the 7th century is when Islam really starts taking off, and by the middle of the 8th century, it's got all of North Africa, Spain, and so on, and quite a bit of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So after the Islamic expansion, the Jews take a much larger role in the expanded trade across that major cultural political barrier between Christian Europe and Islamic North Africa and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. So they're bringing from the West to the East a lot of things that are produced in Europe, like swords, actually. There's a lot of superior steel or iron coming out of Eastern Europe. Furs, right? Very big thing that's not easily available further to the east. So they're bringing the luxury goods that we described earlier to the West, and they're bringing a lot of these raw goods as well to the East. And here's where the more controversial element comes in. In the year 854, a church council banned the trade in Christian slaves. And this is something that we've seen all the way back from the Synod of Elvira in the 4th century and so on, that Christianity may have a problem with slavery in general, but it really has a problem with Jews owning slaves. So there's a lot of bans frequently in medieval history that emphasize the fact that Jews are not allowed to own slaves, and Jews are certainly not allowed to trade in slaves. So when there is a ban on trade in Christian slaves, not only by Jews but by non-Jews as well, so now the Jews become much more important in the slave trade because the slaves are largely traded in Iberian markets under Muslim rule, that is like the south part of the Spanish Portuguese peninsula in places like Granada and so on. So the actual proportion of the Jews involved in the slave trade is very small, right? Only a small number of Jews were engaged in international commerce, and only a small section of the overall commerce was in slaves, but Jews were disproportionate to Christians involved in this trade, and they were definitely dwarfed by the huge amount of slave trade in general by Christians and by Muslims. But on a per capita basis, it's reasonable to assume that just like Jews are overrepresented in commerce in other goods, they're overrepresented in goods like slaves as well. Now, this noxious pattern does not hold true in the same way for the transatlantic slave trade, which was a much larger and in many ways far more exploitative trade when African slaves were sold to the Americas in particular. Certainly there were Jewish slave traders, but they were again a minority among slavers as a whole, and we should bear in mind that this was in the context of the morality and the accepted commercial practices of that day. As offensive as it may seem to us in the 21st century, it was not considered especially offensive in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, with the one exception that Christians would not allow the trade of other Christians. When Eastern Europe, which was the main source of slaves at this time. In fact, there are some theoreticians that say that the word Slav is related to the word esclav or slave. It's also possible in modern Slavic languages it refers to a very different kind of word like glory, like you say Slava Bohu, glory be to God. But be that as it may, as Eastern Europe is increasingly Christianized towards the later part of the Middle Ages, then of course that becomes an area that is off limits to slave traders as well, and much of it will shift even further towards Africa, where there are still larger proportions of non-Christians available for sale in Europe. Adding to this, besides the slave trade, there was a significant expansion of trade routes in Northern Europe. The population in general in northern France and Germany has been expanding since around the year 1000. There are a lot of theories as to why this happened. It is a noted phenomenon. It appears that the agricultural output increased significantly over this time, so it might actually have a climactic reason for it. It could be that there was, just a general warming of the northern part of Europe at this point, or something to make it much more arable. But at any rate, as the north opens up, more trade routes through northern Europe open up, and Jewish populations there increase, and it's kind of like a cycle of the The general expansion of trade means the expansion of Jewish migration to Europe and the increase in the population as there is more income and so on. But that's essentially what is happening throughout this period in terms of trade. But once the slave trade becomes much more difficult to maintain, particularly in Northern Europe, and as there are increasing levels of anti-Semitic restriction on Jewish trade, which we're going to talk about a little bit more next week in particular. So Jewish trade begins to largely decrease from the huge international scale and become much smaller and become much more focused on retail and on local sales. And I reflect on this personally as well. I already told you one personal story about the charity collector that went all the way up from Montreal to my hometown. But in many ways, this is really my own family story. Here's my father, Alav Shalom, may he rest in peace, standing in front of the family store in 1957, way up in northern remote Ontario. His father is the Alex in the Alex Abrahamson son. My father is the son there. You know, he ended up migrating from northern Russia and he came to Canada thinking he was going to become a farmer. He was terrible at farming, like we see the pattern we talked about last video. And he ended up going into dry goods sales and connecting with lots of middlemen, what they call jobbers, down in Toronto. So he was able to connect with a largely Jewish environment of commerce, bringing mainly work clothes and things like that up to this dry goods store that was the economic mainstay of the Abramson family for almost a century. So it's really, in my own person, I feel the connection with this particular period in Jewish history as well. Okay, so that's a discussion of the goods involved in Jewish commerce. Now we get to perhaps the most difficult aspect of it, which is specifically the involvement of Jews in money lending.